Hey, you know what Dragon Ball game has the best soundtrack? Wait, stop. Can we not do that today? Don't you see how much he's looking at us right now? Ugh, scary. Yeah, I guess we don't need to do that today. As long as you agree that Budokai 3 has the best soundtrack in all of Dragon Ball games. I think you meant Budokai Tenkaichi 3 has the best soundtrack in all Dragon Ball games. No, I meant Budokai 3 has the best soundtrack in all of Dragon Ball games.
Oh, come on! I know that you know that.
Can't we just agree on one thing for once, three for once? Why do you always have to go in
silence?
You two, out. Now! You've seen tier lists about Dragon Ball characters. You may have seen a Dragon Ball game tier list. But have you ever seen a tier list about Dragon Ball games' music? This was a suggestion from a comment and I thought it was a pretty interesting idea. If you have a tier list suggestion, you can comment that down below and I may or may not do it. As with every tier list I make, I need to make a set of rules. For this tier list, I decided to go with the Dragon Ball games I talked about in the 3 videos I went over the different eras. So the PS2 era, PS3 era, and present era will all get mentioned. If I'm being honest with you, I would put all these games in S tier. So let's assume that wherever I put them in this video, they are still highly regarded. So if I put a game in C tier, that just means compared to the other DBZ game OSTs, I wouldn't really prefer this one. With all that being said, let me start. This is gonna be a long video. Starting off with the PS2 era, Budokai is such a classic. In fact, all 3 games have amazing soundtracks. But where would I put this compared to the other 2? Well, that's a hard one. I'd say this game's soundtrack could be a hit or miss. Let me give you an example. A handful of these songs are viewed as legendary classics. However, if I were to give you a song not from these classics, a lot of them would be either okay or just something you would forget. So in terms of Budokai 1, it gets an A tier. Its highs are peak, yet its lows are more common. Remember, this is a tier list about each game's music. Budokai 2 is an interesting one. A majority of the music in this game is reused from Budokai 1. However, for what the new songs have to offer, they are amazing. I think that only 1 or 2 of them bore me, but the majority is great. They all are either bops or they just give an intense feeling. So the fact that you have about 15 new good songs in the bangers from Budokai 1 just proves that this soundtrack is great. But since it's got a bunch from Budokai 1, I still can't give it an S tier. So I'll give it an A tier, but above Budokai 1. Now I regret saying this, but I'm not a huge fan of Budokai 3's OST. Once again, many of the songs are reused from the other 2 Budokai games. There are some new great tracks added in this one as well. I really like them, but I feel like I can compare this to Budokai 1. A lot of good tracks, but there are some misses in there too. However, this game is home to one certain song. And in my books, this is the most legendary song in all of Dragon Ball games. And that song is Flight in the Dark Side. You don't understand how important of a song this is for me. Without it, many of the skits in my video would be less impactful. So because of that alone, I have to give this game an S tier. I am 100% serious about this. Too bad the Budokai series' music was plagiarized. I'm not gonna spend too much time on this game. Sagas is a bad game, or at least many people claim it is. But one thing I will call it bad for is its music. You don't understand how much time I spent trying to find a good song from this game for my best DBZ games video. That was painful. So I'm giving this game a D tier. Still no C tier in an Eebworld tier list. Budokai Tenkaichi is an interesting case. Unlike the other games, this game has no original music, and because of that, I can't really put this in a tier, so I'll have to make up a new tier, and that tier will be called the reuse tier. This won't be the last time you see this tier. Super Dragon Ball Z is really underrated. I don't really understand where the hate for this game comes from, but I feel like it's pretty unjust. But in terms of the music, this is the most arcade sounding Dragon Ball music you'll ever hear. And that isn't a bad thing. It fits the game pretty well, so it makes sense why they went with this style. However, not every track from this game is a super banger. Also, unless you count Sagas, this is the first game not to have any reused music, so this game will be an A tier. Budokai Tenkaichi 2 has a great soundtrack. It's very fresh and none of the songs here are reused from any previous game so far. If anything, this is the least sounding Dragon Ball music you'll ever hear. I don't know how to explain it, but because of the games before this, you would expect many rock songs and such. But this game does not have that. Instead, a lot of the songs sound more electronic or so. That's why I wouldn't really call this music Dragon Ball. However, this soundtrack is still pretty iconic but not talked about enough. I'll put this soundtrack in A tier.
There are too many A tiers here, huh?
The game you probably have been waiting for. Budokai Tenkaichi 3 is probably the most popular Dragon Ball game to date. Many people talk about the characters in this game, but there are few who mainly focus on its music. Let's start off with its legendary opening song. If you like Dragon Ball, it would be pretty crazy if you haven't heard it once. But besides its opening, this soundtrack is fantastic. The theme goes back to a rock one after Budokai Tenkaichi 2's Not That. I'm sure many people like this soundtrack, and I'm one of them. All the songs are so intense and it's perfect for the gameplay. So this game gets an S tier.
I'm sure many people would put this game in S tier for many different reasons.
Infinite World was the last PS2 Dragon Ball game. This game came out after Burst Limit, weirdly enough, but the soundtrack is actually completely original. It sounds very similar to Burst Limit's soundtrack, which I'll go over in a bit. I have no clue about the change of direction in terms of the theme, but it feels so relaxing. I have no idea how they achieved that. Not only that, it's got such a summertime vibe too. If anyone knows what that genre of music is called, please comment it down below. Something that's a shame is, it actually reuses music from the Budokai games. That's actually very strange given that by that point, the composer was a different person. I wouldn't put this soundtrack very high in the tier list, so A tier will do.
Another A tier.
From Burst Limit onwards, Dragon Ball games had a very different style in its music. Yes, it's still rock and whatnot, but the way it sounded was very different. It's really hard to explain since I'm not good at explaining music, but just know it doesn't feel the same anymore. As I said with Infinite World, these two have a very similar feeling in their OST. It's a pretty funky, jazzy, rocky feeling. I like how different this actually feels from all Dragon Ball games so far. I'll give it an A tier. Although I said that Burst Limit is where Dragon Ball game music changed, you can absolutely feel it in Raging Blast. This does not feel close at all to the Budokai Tenkaichi series. The best way I can describe it is, Budokai Tenkaichi's soundtrack was a lot faster paced, while this one is more dramatic. That's not a bad thing though. It's a really solid soundtrack and I don't really mind the change. The soundtrack is pretty nostalgic for me given that I don't really revisit PS3 games a lot. I'll give this soundtrack an A tier.
That makes 7 A tiers.
Raging Blast 2 is a weird one. The version of the game I own is PAL, so many of the songs were reused Tenkaichi 2 songs. But when I listened to the original soundtrack, this game did not do it for me. I've already been harsh on Raging Blast 2 in my worst DBZ games video, so it just sounds like I'm adding more salt in the wounds. But really, this soundtrack is a bit too slow, or maybe even boring to me. So I'm sorry Raging Blast 2 fans, but I'll have to put this soundtrack in B tier.
Although this game was low, at least it wasn't another A tier.
Ultimate Tenkaichi may be one of the worst Dragon Ball games to exist, but I cannot say the same for the music. The music is really awesome. This one is heavily focused on rock, and as I said earlier, that fits Dragon Ball pretty well. But these songs are so much different from Raging Blast 1 and 2. I would say this is the only saving grace this game has, the fact that its soundtrack is amazing. So I'm putting this game in S tier.
The only time you'll ever see me put this game on S tier in any tier list.
Battle of Z was not a great Dragon Ball game. And guess what? This game had reused music. I'm pretty sure that 99% of the music in this game is just from previous games. The only exception being the Chala Head Chala remix. But other than that, there really isn't much to say. Actually, there is. For some reason, the music in this game randomly cuts and either stops or changes to another song. It's so weird. All in all, Budokai Tenkaichi 1 is getting a friend in the reused tier. And now for the recent Dragon Ball games. Starting with Xenoverse 1, a very good soundtrack. Although this game was made by the same people who made Burst Limit, the music direction is pretty far off from that game. It's a lot more of a mix between rock and electronic, at least for the most part. Every song is just so hype and really livens up the gameplay. But Xenoverse 1 is a pretty bland game, so I guess the music is a saving grace for it. It's strangely nostalgic given that this game came out in 2015, but then again, 2015 was 8 years ago. I always enjoy coming back to listen to this soundtrack just as much as the classic era of Dragon Ball games' music. Classic era as in Budokai and Budokai Tenkaichi, so this will be the 4th game in S tier. Xenoverse 2 on the other hand doesn't have anything special in its OST. Honestly, I'm glad that the music in this game is mainly Xenoverse 1 music because the songs in this game are pretty whatever. However, the one thing that this game does have is that amazing character creation music.
I don't know who thought this song up, but whoever did, please let me meet you.
I really love that song. It's so funky and bopping. The Hub World's music is also pretty good. So for that, I'll put this game in B tier. It barely dodged C tier. Fighters is next, and it's pretty solid. I'd say this is the most Dragon Ball sounding music, at least for the games. Remember when I made that claim about Dragon Ball music fitting the rock genre? Well, I was mainly referring to the games. I don't know why I didn't clarify that until now. This game is pretty consistent in its music. They all pretty much sound close to each other. I wouldn't say it's bad because of that, since it does give this game's soundtrack its own identity. So this game will be an A tier.
I had to include at least one more game in this tier before I ended the video.
The semi-last game here is Kakarot, and I'll say, I'm glad I clarified that statement of rock music fitting Dragon Ball, because this game's soundtrack is literally the most Dragon Ball sounding game. I think it definitely works with this game since it's a retelling of the Dragon Ball Z story in an RPG format, and RPGs do tend to have that adventure-styled music. So why not make the music sound close to the original Dragon Ball music? I'll put this game in B tier since I wouldn't necessarily say I'd come back to this game's soundtrack. And for the last game, it is Breakers. Now I'm not the biggest fan of this game, and I could say the same for its soundtrack. I wouldn't say it's bad, I'd just say it's not that fun to listen to. It is pretty dramatic and that is great for a survival game, but either way, it doesn't have that replayability factor to it. So you wouldn't catch me listening to this OST unless I have to make a video about this game. So this game has a C tier soundtrack.
So this was the first C tier in an Eebworld tier list.
And that's all the games for today. Will I ever add on to this? Probably not. This list is already long enough. But it was nice to go through each game's soundtrack like this. Again, this is my opinion, so you don't have to agree to this list if you don't want to.
Dragon Ball games all have such unique soundtracks. I didn't even realize that many of them repeat songs from previous games, so that was pretty interesting. As I said, many of these games would have been in S tier if this were a different type of music tier list. I had fun making this tier list, so if you have any tier list suggestions, leave that in the comments down below. You could also tell me what you thought of this tier list and where you would put these games. Anyways, time to learn how to critique music well.